It is the 14th of July, 1944. The bocage country of Normandy stretches in every direction, a maze of sunken lanes, ancient hedgerows, and mud so thick it swallows men whole. Somewhere in this tangled green nightmare, a British sergeant named David Hartley sits in the commander's hatch of a machine that weighs less than 7 tons. Around him, the enemy hides. German tanks, the Panzer IV, the Tiger, the Panther, each one outweighs his vehicle by a factor of 3, 4, even 7. Their guns can punch through his armor at ranges where his own crew cannot even see them. Hartley knows this. Every man in his unit knows this, and yet, somehow, they have been ordered forward, into bocage country, into the teeth of the German defense, into a fight that every doctrine book says they should lose. What Hartley does not know, what nobody in the British chain of command fully appreciates yet, is that this tiny, underpowered, dismissed machine is about to become one of the most dangerous weapons on the Normandy battlefield. Not because it is faster, not because it is stronger, but because it is small enough to be invisible and smart enough to be lethal. This is the story of the Crusader tank variant and the broader family of light-armored vehicles that the Allies fielded across France in 1944. But more than that, this is the story of a tactical idea, an idea that every senior officer laughed at, that the production boards nearly canceled, and that ultimately changed how armored warfare worked in close quarters. To understand why that idea mattered, you have to understand just how broken the situation was in Normandy by the summer of 1944, because the war in the West had not gone the way anyone planned. And the reason it had not gone that way was something no general could fix with more men or more machines. It was the land itself. The land was the enemy, and the land was winning. The Allied landings on June 6th were a triumph of logistics, planning, and extraordinary courage under fire. Thousands of men stormed beaches defended by prepared positions, machine gun nests, and artillery batteries. They fought through surf and sand and took horrific casualties to gain a foothold on the coast of France. It was one of the most difficult and daring military operations ever attempted. But within days of establishing that foothold, the liberation of France stalled. The initial momentum, the shock and chaos that had gripped the German command during the first 48 hours after the landings faded. The Germans reorganized, they brought reinforcements forward, and they settled into the bocage to fight a defensive battle that they had been preparing for months before the first Allied soldier ever set foot on a Normandy beach. The problem was not manpower. The Allies had manpower to spare. The problem was not will. The men fighting in Normandy were some of the bravest soldiers in the world. The problem was not supply. The logistics chain stretching back across the English Channel was functioning well. The problem was the land itself. Normandy is not open steppe. It is not rolling plains like the ones Soviet and German armored divisions clashed across on the Eastern Front, where tanks could see each other at ranges of a kilometer or more, and the battle became a brutal exchange of long-range gunnery. Normandy is bocage, a word that comes from the French for woodland, and it is exactly that. Centuries of Norman farming had produced a landscape carved into thousands of small fields, each one surrounded by hedgerows that had been growing and thickening for generations. These hedgerows are not garden fences. They are not the kind of thing you trim on a Saturday afternoon. They are dense, tangled walls of earth, root, and vegetation, often 1.5 meters high, sometimes 2 meters or more, built up over centuries until they are nearly as solid as a stone wall. Trees grow along the tops. Deep root systems bind the earth together so tightly that even artillery shells sometimes fail to destroy them completely. Rain turns the ground beneath them into sucking mud, and from the German side of those hedgerows, they are perfect defensive positions. A single machine gun nest tucked behind one of these walls can cover an entire field of fire with devastating effect. An anti-tank gun can sit completely invisible for 200 meters or more and destroy an approaching Sherman or Churchill tank before the crew inside even spots the muzzle flash. The bocage turned Normandy into a fortress without walls, a maze of natural fortifications that the Germans had spent weeks preparing and that the Allies had to fight through meter by bloody meter. By early July, the Allies had pushed inland only about 30 kilometers from the beaches. 30 kilometers, after the greatest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare, after the sacrifice of thousands of men on those beaches, after weeks of fighting in mud and rain and constant German counterattacks, the front had barely moved. And the reason it had barely moved was simple, and it was brutal. The tanks, the main offensive weapon the Allies had brought to break through German lines and exploit any breach, were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. The numbers tell the story with painful and undeniable clarity. In the first month after D-Day, the British Second Army alone lost over 300 tanks. Some estimates for the entire Allied force across the Normandy beachhead by mid-July place total armored losses at nearly 400 machines. And for every tank that burned in a bocage lane or exploded at a hedgerow gap, the crews inside, men who had trained for months, who understood their machines intimately, who knew every bolt and rivet, were gone too. Killed or wounded or captured. The replacement tanks that arrived from the factories back in England were crewed by men with far less experience, far less confidence, and far less understanding of the specific terrain they were being asked to fight and die in. The gap between what doctrine promised and what the bocage delivered was enormous. It was growing wider every single day, and nobody at the senior level seemed to have a convincing answer for how to close it. Standard armored doctrine in 1944 was built around the idea of combined arms, infantry supported by artillery, with tanks pushing ahead to exploit breakthroughs once the enemy line cracked under pressure. It was a doctrine that had worked brilliantly in North Africa, in Sicily, and in the early stages of the Italian campaign. On open ground, it was devastating. But in bocage country, the fundamental assumptions behind that doctrine simply did not hold. The tanks could not see. They could not maneuver. They could not exploit anything because the hedgerows boxed them into narrow corridors with no room to spread out, no room to flank an enemy position, no room to do anything except move forward in single file and pray that the next 200 meters of lane were not a kill zone. A Sherman tank moving through bocage was essentially driving blind. The commander sitting in the hatch could see maybe 50 meters in any direction on a good day, sometimes less. Visibility was so poor that crews reported not being able to identify whether the shape ahead of them was a hedgerow, a destroyed vehicle blocking the lane, or an enemy tank sitting in a prepared position with its gun pointed directly at them, until it was far too late to do anything about it. And the Germans knew exactly where the Allied tanks would appear. They had been watching the bocage for months. They had surveyed every lane, every field, every possible gap in the hedgerows where a vehicle could pass through. Every single one of those gaps was a kill zone, covered by at least one anti-tank gun, and usually more. German crews had positioned themselves with devastating precision, using the hedgerows for concealment and the lanes as natural shooting galleries. A tank that tried to push through a hedgerow gap was often destroyed before it had traveled 30 meters into open ground on the other side. The Germans did not need to be brave to defend the bocage. They did not need to be fast or aggressive. They simply needed to wait. And the bocage made waiting easy, and made attacking nearly suicidal. If you have not subscribed to this channel yet, do it now. This is exactly the kind of forgotten tactical story we break down every week, and what comes next changes everything you thought you knew about how tanks actually fought in World War II. The doctrine said the way forward was firepower and weight. Bring more armor to the front. Bring bigger guns. Concentrate force at a single point and smash through the defense before it can react. But firepower and weight meant nothing if you could not see the enemy. And you could not see the enemy because the bocage made visibility almost zero at every critical moment of every engagement. This was the fundamental problem facing the Allied High Command in Normandy by mid-July 1944. It was not a problem of courage or supply or industrial capacity. It was a problem of tactics, and no amount of additional Sherman tanks rolling off the production lines in Detroit or Birmingham could solve it alone. The bocage demanded a different kind of thinking entirely, and that thinking, when it finally began to emerge, would not come from the generals sitting in comfortable headquarters behind the front lines. It would come from the men closest to the hedgerows, the men in the smallest machines, the men that everyone else in the army had already written off as irrelevant to the war. So, what do you do when the standard answer stops working? When every textbook solution has been tried, every conventional approach has failed, and the enemy is still sitting behind their hedgerows exactly where they were a week ago, waiting patiently for you to make the same fatal mistake again, you look for a different kind of answer entirely. You look for something the enemy did not plan for, something the terrain itself cannot neutralize, something that breaks the pattern the Germans have spent weeks preparing to exploit. And that is where the light tanks come in. Not because they were powerful, not because they were well-armored or well-armed in any conventional sense that would impress a senior staff officer reviewing capabilities on paper, but because they were something the Germans had simply not prepared to face in the bocage. They were small, they were fast, and they could fit into spaces where heavier machines could not even dream of going without tearing apart the very cover that was supposed to keep them hidden. The British Crusader tank had first seen action in North Africa in 1941 and 1942, where it earned a reputation that was mixed at best and charitable at worst. It was underpowered for its size. Its early production variants were plagued with mechanical failures that frustrated crews in the field and embarrassed the engineers back home who had designed and built it. The engine overheated in desert conditions, the suspension wore out faster than anticipated, the turret mechanism jammed under dust and sand. It was, by the brutal standards of North African warfare, an unreliable machine. Its 6-pounder gun, while effective enough against mid-war German tanks at close engagement ranges, was badly outclassed by the newer and heavier Panther and Tiger at anything beyond 500 meters. By 1944, the Crusader was largely being phased out as a frontline battle tank across all branches of the British Army. The Sherman and the Churchill had taken over as the primary armored vehicles of the war effort in the West. The Crusader was considered obsolete, a relic of an earlier, less sophisticated stage of the conflict. Some of the crews who still operated certain variants of it called it a toy tank. They said it with genuine contempt because it was too light to trade blows with a Panzer IV at any meaningful engagement range, let alone survive a direct confrontation with a Tiger or a Panther. It could not survive a direct hit from almost anything the Germans fielded on the front line. A single well-aimed shell from a German 75mm gun would destroy it. An 88mm shell would not just destroy it, it would tear it apart. The math was simple, and it was brutal, and it left very little room for optimism. And yet, and this is the part that changes the entire story, the part that matters more than anything that came before, certain variants of the Crusader and the broader philosophy behind light armored vehicles operating in complex terrain were about to prove something that no senior officer had seriously considered. They were about to prove that survival was not always the point. Sometimes the point was something else entirely. Sometimes the point was not to win the fight on equal terms. It was to change where the fight happened. It was to force the enemy to defend positions they never thought needed defending, from directions they never thought to watch. It was, in essence, to rewrite the rules of engagement entirely. The idea itself was not new. Light reconnaissance vehicles had existed in warfare for centuries before the invention of the tank. Cavalry scouts had always operated ahead of the main force, moving fast across the landscape, gathering critical information about enemy positions and movements, striking when the moment presented itself, and pulling back into cover before the enemy could organize a proper response. It was an old idea dressed in new steel. But in the specific and brutal context of bocage warfare in Normandy in 1944, light tanks offered something that no one sitting in the senior planning staffs had fully thought through or appreciated. They offered access. They offered reach. They offered the ability to penetrate into spaces that heavier machines simply could not enter without destroying the very cover that made stealth possible. A Crusader tank variant, stripped of unnecessary equipment and weight where possible, could move through narrower lanes than a Sherman. It could navigate tighter turns in the sunken bocage roads that wound between fields. It could slip through gaps in the hedgerows that a 30-ton Sherman tank simply could not fit through without tearing the entire hedgerow apart, showering earth and roots across the lane, and announcing its presence to every German position within a kilometer in every direction. More importantly, a light tank could move quietly enough, or at least quietly enough in relative terms compared to a heavier machine, that by the time a German crew spotted it through the gaps in the hedgerows, the light tank was already at dangerously close range. And at close range, the entire equation of armored warfare shifted dramatically in favor of the smaller machine. A Panther tank is a formidable and fearsome machine under any circumstances. Its frontal armor is 80 millimeters thick, angled at a degree that makes it significantly harder to penetrate than the raw number alone would suggest. At 1,000 meters, it is nearly invulnerable to most Allied guns then in widespread service. Even the Sherman's 76mm high-velocity gun struggled to punch through Panther frontal armor at ranges beyond 600 meters under normal combat conditions. But at 200 meters, at 100 meters, at 50 meters, the geometry of the engagement changes completely and dramatically. A well-placed shot from even a light tank's gun, fired not into the thick frontal armor, but into the thinner side armor, into the rear plating behind the engine compartment, into the vulnerable sections around the hatches and vision ports and exhaust grills, could disable or destroy a machine 10 times its own weight. The Germans had built their entire defensive posture in the bocage on the assumption that the Allies would attack with heavy armor, moving through predictable gaps in the hedgerows, engaging at predictable ranges where the German guns were already sighted and zeroed. They had not built those positions to defend against something small, fast, and appearing from an unexpected angle at point-blank range. That was the gap in their thinking, and it was a gap that light tanks were uniquely positioned to exploit. This was the underdog insight. Not beat the tiger head-on in a straight fight at 800 meters. That was suicide, and everyone knew it. But never let it see you coming, and never fight it on its terms. It was deception. It was patience. It was the willingness to abandon everything that doctrine taught about how armored warfare was supposed to work, and instead fight a completely different kind of war, one built on stealth, on surprise, and on the courage to close the distance before the enemy could react. Doctrine said that was impossible. Doctrine said light tanks were suicide against main battle tanks in any engagement, regardless of terrain or range or angle of attack. Doctrine said the answer to any armored problem was more firepower, more weight, more concentration of force at the decisive point. And doctrine was wrong, but only if the crews were willing to think and fight in ways that made senior commanders deeply uncomfortable and challenged assumptions they had held for years. The resistance to this idea was immediate, and it was fierce. Senior commanders in the British Armored Corps had spent years building their entire operational doctrine around the Sherman and the Churchill. These were the machines that were supposed to win the war in the West. They were the centerpiece of every offensive plan, every operational projection, every confident briefing delivered to the high command about how the campaign in France would unfold. Admitting that a smaller, older, supposedly obsolete vehicle could contribute meaningfully to breaking the bocage deadlock was not just a tactical concession, it was an admission that the entire framework they had built their professional reputations on was incomplete, that it had blind spots that were costing lives every single day. The bocage did not care about doctrine. The bocage did not care about what worked in North Africa, or what the textbooks said, or what senior officers believed should happen based on years of theoretical study and careful planning. The bocage only cared about what actually worked when bullets were flying and tanks were burning and men were dying in the mud. And in the narrow, tangled, deadly green corridors of Normandy in the summer of 1944, what worked was anything. Anything at all that could get close to the enemy without being seen first. By mid-July 1944, several British units had begun experimenting with exactly this approach, not because they had received orders from above to do so, not because some brilliant staff officer had written a memo recommending it, but because the men on the ground were desperate. They were watching their heavier tanks burn in kill zones. They were watching their friends die in engagements that lasted less than 10 seconds. And some of them, the ones who were still alive, the ones who had seen enough to understand what was happening, started looking for another way, any other way. Small groups of light tanks, sometimes 3 machines, sometimes 4, rarely more, began moving through the bocage in single file, using the hedgerows themselves as cover rather than treating them as obstacles to be pushed through or destroyed. They did not charge into open ground. They did not engage at long range where the Germans had every advantage. They crept along the sunken lanes, moving slowly and carefully, using the same narrow paths the Germans themselves used for supply runs and patrol movements. And when they found a position, a gun emplacement, a machine gun nest, an observation post, they struck from positions that the German defensive plan had never considered a serious threat. It was slow work. It was painstaking work. It required a kind of patience and discipline that was difficult to maintain when every instinct was screaming to close the distance faster, to get it over with, to end the engagement before the enemy could react. And the first real tests of this approach, when they came in the 3rd week of July, did not go smoothly at all. The terrain made everything harder than it looked on paper, or on any reconnaissance photograph taken from the air. Hedgerows that appeared passable from an aerial view turned out to be impassable on the ground, blocked by root systems so deep and earth so compacted that even a tank engine at full power could not push through without tearing apart the cover and exposing the vehicle completely. Lanes that were mapped as open and navigable were blocked by debris, by destroyed vehicles dragged into position by the Germans to create roadblocks, by collapsed sections of hedgerow brought down by artillery, by the accumulated wreckage of 6 weeks of brutal close-quarters fighting. Crews found themselves stuck in narrow lanes with no room to turn around, engines revving uselessly, tracks churning in mud, their machines exposed and vulnerable, while the crews desperately searched for an alternative route that, more often than not, simply did not exist. The bocage swallowed plans whole. A route that had worked yesterday might be completely impassable today. The landscape changed constantly as the fighting reshaped it, and every change created new problems for the men trying to navigate it. And then there were the ambushes. In at least one documented engagement during the third week of July, a small group of light tanks moving carefully through bocage was suddenly hit by a German anti-tank team that had been waiting in a ditch alongside a lane, completely invisible, completely silent, completely hidden until the exact moment they opened fire. The first machine in the column took a direct hit at close range and was destroyed almost instantly. The shell punched through the thin armor and the crew inside had no warning and no time to react. The second tank was badly damaged by a follow-up shot, its crew scrambling frantically to evacuate the burning vehicle before the flames reached the ammunition compartment. Only the third vehicle, whose commander managed to throw the machine into reverse and back it into the nearest hedgerow, breaking visual contact with the German team, survived the engagement. It was, by any honest and objective measure, a failure. 3 tanks went in, 1 came out. The Germans had defended their position with almost no effort, no additional resources, and no significant risk to their own crew. If this had been the only result of the light tank experiment, the idea would have died quietly in some staff report, and the bocage would have continued to grind the Allied advance to a bloody crawl for weeks longer. But it was not the only result. And that is what kept the idea alive through the failures and the losses and the skepticism of the men above. Alongside that failure, and alongside several others like it, there were other engagements, quieter, less dramatic, but far more instructive about what light tanks could actually accomplish when the conditions were right, and the crews had the skill and the nerve to execute the plan. In several instances across the bocage during late July, small light tank crews managed to slip through hedgerow gaps at night or during periods of heavy rain when visibility was reduced even further, move along lanes the Germans had not adequately covered or even bothered to monitor, and strike German positions from angles that were never supposed to be threatened. Records suggest that in one such engagement, a crew of light tanks approached a German gun position from the rear, from a direction the Germans had not even posted a lookout because no one had considered it a plausible avenue of attack. The light tanks destroyed the position at a range of less than 80 meters. The German crew had no time to react, no time to traverse their gun around to face the new threat, no time to call for support or reinforcement. The position was silenced before anyone on the German side fully understood what had just happened or where the attack had come from. It was not a glorious charge. It was not the kind of engagement that fills history books or gets immortalized in films or painted into museum murals for future generations to admire. But it removed a threat, a single gun position sitting behind a hedgerow that had been pinning down an entire British battalion for days. Pinning them down meant they could not advance, could not maneuver, could not do anything except sit in their positions and absorb casualties while waiting for someone to deal with that one gun. And that, in bocage warfare, where every 100 meters of ground cost lives and every day of delay gave the Germans more time to strengthen their defenses, was worth more than a dozen heroic frontal assaults against prepared positions that ended in burning tanks and dead crews. If you are enjoying this breakdown of how the war was actually fought at the tactical level, make sure you hit like and subscribe. We cover stories exactly like this one every single week on this channel, and there is far more to come. These small-scale engagements, scattered across the bocage over the course of several weeks, forced a gradual and sometimes reluctant shift in how British armored commanders thought about the bocage problem. It was not a sudden revolution in thinking. There was no single moment where a general stood before his staff and declared that light tanks had transformed the campaign. It was a slow, painful, incremental process of adaptation, of commanders on the ground watching what actually worked in practice, under real combat conditions, and quietly adjusting their tactical approach to match reality rather than doctrine. The change spread not through official memos or formal orders, but through word of mouth between crews. Commanders compared notes after engagements. Men who had survived talked to men who had not yet been tested. Word spread gradually through the ranks that there were ways through the bocage that did not end in a burning tank and a dead crew. But those ways required a completely different mindset, a willingness to be patient, to be quiet, and to strike only when the moment was exactly right. By late July and into August 1944, the use of light and medium tanks in small, fast-moving groups had become noticeably more common across the British sector of the Normandy front. The change was not uniform. It did not happen everywhere at once. Some commanders embraced it quickly, driven by desperation and by the evidence of their own eyes. Others resisted for weeks longer, unwilling to abandon the doctrine they had built their careers around. But the bocage was not patient, and the war was not waiting for anyone to catch up with what the men on the ground had already figured out. Gradually, unit by unit, engagement by engagement, the approach spread. The Sherman itself began to be employed differently, not as a breakthrough vehicle charging into open ground to exploit a gap in the enemy line, but as a mobile gun platform, moving in small teams through bocage, using hedgerows for concealment, engaging German positions at close range where the Sherman's gun could punch through armor that would have stopped it at longer distances, and withdrawing back into cover before the Germans could bring their heavier weapons to bear on the exposed flanks. The Crusader variants and other light vehicles did not replace the Sherman. They were never meant to, and no serious person suggested they could. They supplemented it. They filled tactical gaps that heavier machines simply could not reach. And in doing so, they began to help solve a problem that had been strangling the Allied advance for weeks. The numbers, when historians began to compile and analyze them after the war ended, told a story that vindicated the approach, at least in part, and at least in the specific and brutal context of bocage warfare in Normandy during the summer of 1944. In the final week of July 1944, during the breakout operation known as Operation Cobra, Allied forces pushed south out of the bocage at a speed that genuinely shocked the German high command. The operation covered over 60 kilometers in less than a single week, a pace of advance that would have seemed impossible just 2 weeks earlier, when the front had been grinding forward at less than a kilometer a day. Armored losses during the breakout were significantly lower per kilometer of advance than they had been during the grinding, bloody bocage fighting of the previous month. The ratio of ground gain to tanks lost improved dramatically once Allied forces moved beyond the densest hedgerow country and into more open terrain where their numerical superiority and technological advantages could finally be brought to bear against a German force that was running short of reserves and reinforcements. Historians note that the shift in tactical approach, smaller unit engagements, closer combat ranges, better exploitation of terrain for concealment and surprise, was one of several critical factors that made the breakout possible. It was not the only factor, and anyone who suggests it was, is oversimplifying a complex and multi-layered operation. Air superiority played an enormous and decisive role in disrupting German communications and destroying their ability to move reinforcements. Artillery support was decisive in breaking open prepared defensive positions that infantry and armor alone could not crack. In sheer weight of numbers, the industrial might of the United States and Britain producing tanks, aircraft, artillery shells, and ammunition at a rate that Germany simply could not match no matter how efficiently they used their remaining production capacity, ultimately decided the war in the West. But the bocage had taught a lesson, and it was a lesson that senior commanders could no longer afford to ignore or dismiss. Weight and firepower alone did not win armored engagements in complex terrain. Tactical flexibility did. And sometimes tactical flexibility meant trusting the smallest machine on the battlefield to do the job that the biggest and most powerful one simply could not. The consequences of that lesson extended far beyond the hedgerows of Normandy and far beyond the summer of 1944. The experience of bocage warfare fed directly into how Allied armored forces organized, trained, and operated for the remainder of the war in France and into the final campaigns in Germany itself. The idea that light, fast vehicles could operate independently, could strike a specific target, withdraw into cover before the enemy could organize a response, and then strike again from a completely different direction, became a foundation of Allied armored tactics in the final months of the conflict. It influenced how reconnaissance units were organized and deployed across the front. It shaped the development of post-war light tank programs on both sides of the emerging Iron Curtain. The Soviet Union, watching Allied operations in France with intense and careful interest throughout 1944 and 1945, drew its own conclusions about the value of fast, mobile armored vehicles in complex and wooded terrain. Those conclusions would shape Soviet armored doctrine and vehicle development for decades to come after the war ended. The Americans, who had begun fielding the M24 Chaffee light tank in late 1944, found that it performed remarkably well in exactly the kind of close-quarters, terrain-dominated fighting that the Bocage had first demanded. The M24 weighed just over 16 tons, light enough to move quickly through villages, forests, and broken ground, but armed with a 75mm gun that could destroy most German tanks at the close engagement ranges where Bocage-style fighting took place. By the end of the war, the Chaffee had established itself as one of the most versatile and capable armored vehicles in the entire Allied arsenal. Not because it could beat a Tiger in a straight fight at 1,000 meters. It could not, and no one ever seriously claimed it could, but because it could do things a Tiger could never do: move fast through tight spaces, strike from unexpected positions, and disappear back into cover before the enemy could organize a meaningful response.